The desert wind howled through the small Mexican border town of San Miguel as 78-year-old Esperanza Morales finished her evening prayers. Her weathered hands clutched the rosary beads that had belonged to her grandmother, the same beads that had seen her through decades of hardship, loss, and triumph. The adobe house creaked softly around her, its thick walls holding the day's heat like a gentle embrace. Esperanza had lived alone since her husband Miguel passed 5 years ago, but she was far from helpless. Her son Carlos visited weekly, always fussing over her safety in this increasingly dangerous neighborhood. "Mama, you need protection," he would say, his voice heavy with concern. What he didn't know was that she had already found his hidden revolver months ago while cleaning his old bedroom. A .38 Special tucked behind loose floorboards under his childhood bed. Tonight felt different. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic, had given way to an unsettling silence. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Esperanza's instincts, honed by nearly 8 decades of life, whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. As she prepared for bed, a soft scraping sound from the back of the house made her freeze. It wasn't the wind. Someone was testing her back door. The scraping sound came again, more deliberate this time. Esperanza's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind remained sharp. She had survived the revolution as a child, raised 7 children through poverty, and buried a husband after 53 years of marriage. 2 common thieves would not be her undoing. Moving with surprising stealth for her age, she crept toward Carlos's old room. The floorboards beneath her bare feet knew exactly where to step to avoid creaking, a skill learned from decades of sneaking around sleeping children. Her arthritic fingers found the loose board immediately, and within seconds the cold steel of the .38 Special filled her palm. The weight was heavier than she remembered, but oddly comforting. Outside, hushed voices carried through the thin desert air. 2 men speaking in rapid Spanish about the old woman and easy money. They had been watching her, studying her routines. Esperanza's jaw tightened. These weren't desperate souls stealing bread for their families. These were predators who saw her gray hair and stooped shoulders as weakness. The back door rattled softly as someone worked at the lock. Esperanza had lived in this house for 43 years. She knew every sound it made. They would be inside within minutes. She checked the revolver's cylinder. 6 bullets, all accounted for. Carlos had taught her to shoot tin cans behind the house when she was younger, though he never knew she'd been practicing in secret ever since Miguel's death. The lock clicked open. Esperanza positioned herself in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and living room, the revolver steady in her weathered hands. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mija, a cornered mouse can kill a cat if it has the will." Tonight, she would prove that wisdom true. The door creaked open, and 2 shadows slipped inside her sanctuary. The first intruder was tall and lean, his face hidden beneath a dark bandana. He moved like a predator, confident in his assumption that an elderly woman posed no threat. Behind him, a shorter, stockier man followed, clutching a rusty knife that gleamed dully in the moonlight streaming through the kitchen window. They had done this before. Their movements were practiced, coordinated. "Check the bedroom for jewelry," the tall one whispered, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never faced real resistance. Old ladies always keep their valuables under the mattress. Esperanza remained perfectly still in the shadows of the hallway, her breathing controlled and silent. The revolver felt like an extension of her will, steady despite the tremor that usually plagued her hands. She watched as they split up, the shorter man heading toward her bedroom while the tall one began rifling through her kitchen drawers, carelessly scattering her carefully organized utensils across the floor. The sound of her grandmother's china being roughly handled ignited something primal within her. Those dishes had survived the Mexican Revolution, her family's migration north, countless celebrations and sorrows. They were more than objects. They were the physical manifestation of her family's resilience, their refusal to be broken by hardship. "Oi, there's nothing here but old lady junk," the tall one called out, his voice dripping with disgust as he swept her ceramic sugar bowl to the floor. It shattered with a sound that seemed to echo through Esperanza's very soul. That was enough. "Freeze," she commanded, stepping into the kitchen doorway with the revolver raised. Her voice carried the authority of a woman who had disciplined 7 children and commanded respect in a community for decades. "Put your hands where I can see them." The tall intruder spun around, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment the kitchen fell silent except for the sound of his partner's footsteps in the bedroom, still unaware of the dramatic shift in power. The moonlight caught the barrel of the .38 Special, and suddenly the predator realized he had become the prey. "You've got to be kidding me," he sneered, though his voice betrayed a tremor of uncertainty. "Put that thing down before you hurt yourself, Abuela." Esperanza's finger tightened on the trigger. "The only person getting hurt tonight will be you if you don't do exactly as I say." The tall intruder's sneer faltered as he stared down the barrel of the .38 Special. Esperanza's hands were rock steady now, decades of suppressed fury and protective instinct flowing through her veins like molten steel. The kitchen, which had been the heart of countless family gatherings, birthday celebrations, and quiet moments of solitude, had become a battlefield where an old woman's will would be tested against criminal arrogance. "I said hands up," Esperanza repeated, her voice carrying the weight of authority that came from raising 7 children in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. "And call your friend back here, now." The tall man's eyes darted toward the hallway, calculating his chances. He was young, maybe 30, with the lean build of someone who survived on the streets. But youth and desperation were no match for the cold determination radiating from the elderly woman before him. Something in her eyes told him this wasn't her first encounter with violence, that beneath the gray hair and wrinkled skin lived someone who had seen enough of life's cruelties to know when mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Miguel!" he called out reluctantly, his voice cracking slightly. "Get back here. We got a problem." Footsteps thundered from the bedroom as the shorter man rushed back, still clutching the rusty knife. He skidded to a halt when he saw his partner with his hands raised, and an elderly woman pointing a gun at them both. For a moment, the absurdity of the situation seemed to freeze all 3 of them in place. "What the hell is this?" Miguel demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and rage. He was younger than his partner, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of desperate hunger in his eyes that spoke of addiction and poor choices. "She's just an old woman." "An old woman with a gun," Esperanza corrected coolly. "And unlike you two, I actually know how to use it." She shifted her aim slightly, the barrel now pointed directly at Miguel's chest. "Drop the knife. Kick it away from you." Miguel's grip tightened on the weapon. "You're bluffing. Old ladies don't shoot people." Esperanza's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Young man, I've buried a husband, 3 of my children, and more friends than you've probably met in your entire life. I've seen revolution, poverty, and heartbreak that would break your spirit in half. You think I'm afraid of adding 2 worthless criminals to that list?" The conviction in her voice sent a chill through both men. This wasn't the trembling victim they had expected to find. This was a woman who had been forged by hardship into something unbreakable, someone who understood that sometimes violence was the only language that predators understood. Miguel's hand began to shake. The knife clattered to the floor. "Good," Esperanza said, never taking her eyes off them. "Now both of you, sit down at my kitchen table, hands flat on the surface where I can see them. One wrong move, and I'll put holes in you that will take the coroner a week to count." The 2 men reluctantly shuffled to Esperanza's kitchen table, the same wooden surface where she had kneaded countless tortillas, helped grandchildren with homework, and shared morning coffee with Miguel before cancer took him. Now it served as an interrogation table, with death hovering in the air like the lingering scent of her evening meal. "Names," she demanded, keeping the revolver trained on them while positioning herself near the wall phone. Her free hand hovered over the receiver, but something held her back from calling the police immediately. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe the predatory instinct that recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. "I'm not telling you nothing, lady," the tall one spat, though his bravado was undermined by the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool desert night. Esperanza's response was swift and decisive. She fired a single shot into the ceiling, the thunderous crack echoing through the small house like divine judgment. Plaster dust rained down on the table as both men flinched violently, their ears ringing from the unexpected explosion of sound. "That was a warning," she said calmly, as if she had merely cleared her throat. "The next one goes through your kneecap. I've got 5 bullets left, and all night to use them. So I'll ask again. Names." "Jesus Christ!" Miguel gasped, his hands trembling against the table surface. "You're completely insane." "No, mijo, I'm completely tired," Esperanza corrected, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had endured too much to care about social niceties. "Tired of punks like you thinking you can take whatever you want from people who've worked their entire lives for what little they have. Tired of being afraid in my own home. Tired of pretending to be helpless when I'm anything but." The tall one, who had been studying her with the calculating gaze of a career criminal, finally spoke. "Look, lady, we didn't mean no harm. We just needed some quick cash, you know? Times are tough." Esperanza's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "Times are tough? I raised 7 children on a seamstress's wages while my husband worked 3 jobs just to keep food on this table. I've had my purse snatched, my car broken into, and my neighbors terrorized by little wolves like you who think the world owes them something. But you know what the difference is between us?" She leaned forward slightly, the gun never wavering. "I earned everything I have through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. You want to take it through fear and violence. That makes you parasites, and I've spent my whole life getting rid of parasites." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second stretching like an eternity. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, but it was heading away from their location, probably responding to some other crisis in a city that had grown too familiar with violence. "So here's what's going to happen," Esperanza continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You're going to tell me exactly how many houses you've robbed, how many old people you've terrorized, and where you've hidden whatever you've stolen. And then we're going to have a conversation about justice." The tall one, who finally introduced himself as Roberto, began to crack under Esperanza's unwavering stare. His street-hardened facade crumbled like adobe in a rainstorm as he realized this wasn't going to end the way he had planned. Miguel, meanwhile, had gone completely pale, his eyes darting between the gun and the hole in the ceiling as if trying to calculate his chances of survival. We hit maybe 6 houses this month," Roberto admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "All old folks, yeah, but we never hurt nobody. We just took some jewelry, electronics, whatever we could sell quick." Esperanza's grip tightened on the revolver. 6 houses, 6 families terrorized because you're too lazy to work for a living. Adi. Her voice carried the accumulated rage of every victim who had never gotten the chance to fight back. "And the Hernandez family on Calle Rosa? The Garcias on Maple Street? Were they among your victims?" Miguel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with recognition and fear. "How do you—" "Because this is my neighborhood, idiots," Esperanza snarled. "I've lived here for 43 years. I know every family, every child, every grandmother you've terrorized. Mrs. Hernandez is 86 years old and hasn't been the same since you broke into her house. She won't even sleep in her own bedroom anymore." The weight of their crimes seemed to settle on the 2 men like a physical burden. Roberto's shoulders sagged as he realized they hadn't been robbing strangers. They had been systematically destroying a community where everyone knew everyone else, where their actions rippled through the social fabric like stones thrown into still water. "We didn't know," Miguel mumbled, though even he seemed to recognize how pathetic the excuse sounded. You didn't want to know, Esperanza corrected sharply. It's easier to steal from people when you don't think of them as human beings with families, memories, and feelings. But here's the thing about consequences, boys. They don't care about your ignorance. She moved closer to the table, the gun still trained on them with unwavering precision. I could call the police right now. You'd be arrested, processed, maybe spend a few months in jail before some overworked public defender gets you a plea deal. You'd be back on the streets within a year, probably hitting different neighborhoods, terrorizing different grandmothers. The kitchen clock continued its relentless ticking, marking time like a countdown to judgment. Outside, the desert wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the empty street like ghostly witnesses to the drama unfolding inside. But I'm not going to call the police, Esperanza continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made her words more terrifying than any threat. Because I've learned something in my 78 years on this earth. Sometimes justice has to be personal, to be effective. Pay them. Both men's eyes widened in terror as the implications of her words sank in. They had come here expecting to victimize a helpless old woman, but instead they had walked into the lair of someone who understood that mercy was a luxury that predators didn't deserve. Please, Senora, we're sorry, Miguel whimpered, his tough guy persona completely evaporated. We'll give back everything we took, we swear. Just please don't kill us. Esperanza studied their faces with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading people's true intentions. She had seen genuine remorse before, in her children when they broke something precious, in her husband when he came home drunk after losing a job, in neighbors who had wronged each other and sought forgiveness. What she saw in these two men wasn't remorse. It was fear of consequences. Nothing more. You're not sorry you robbed those families, she said quietly. You're sorry you got caught. There's a difference, and I'm old enough to know it when I see it. She moved to her kitchen counter, never taking the gun off them, and pulled out a roll of duct tape from the utility drawer. Miguel's father had been a handyman, and she had learned long ago that duct tape could solve almost any problem, including the problem of keeping criminals from escaping. Here's what's going to happen, she announced, tossing the tape onto the table. Roberto, you're going to tape Miguel's hands behind his back. Then, Miguel, you're going to do the same for Roberto. And if either of you tries anything clever, I'll put a bullet in your spine that will leave you paralyzed for the rest of your miserable lives. You can't do this, Roberto protested, though his voice lacked conviction. This is kidnapping. This is illegal. Esperanza's laughter was sharp as broken glass. Illegal? You broke into my home with weapons, threatened my safety, and destroyed my property. In Texas, I have every right to defend myself with lethal force. The only reason you're still breathing is because I'm curious to see how far your cowardice extends. The truth was, Esperanza had already made her decision about their fate, but she wanted them to understand the full weight of their actions first. She wanted them to experience the same helplessness and terror they had inflicted on others. Justice, she had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about understanding. As Roberto reluctantly began taping Miguel's wrists, Esperanza noticed something that made her blood run cold. On Miguel's forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve, was a tattoo, a small rose with the initials E.M. beneath it. The same initials as her granddaughter, Elena Morales, who had been murdered 3 years ago in what police called a random robbery gone wrong. The room seemed to spin around her as the pieces fell into place. The way Miguel had moved through her house, the familiarity with which he had headed straight for the bedroom, the casual cruelty in his voice when he spoke about old lady junk. This wasn't their first time in her home. They had been here before, when Elena was visiting, when her beautiful granddaughter had surprised them during what should have been a simple burglary. You, she whispered, the word carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and unanswered questions. "You killed my Elena." Miguel's face went ashen as he realized his tattoo had been exposed. The small rose with EM. Beneath it, a sick trophy he had gotten to commemorate what he probably thought was just another successful robbery, now blazed like a beacon of guilt under the kitchen light. Roberto stopped mid-motion with the duct tape, sensing the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. "I don't know what you're talking about," Miguel stammered, but his eyes betrayed him. Esperanza had seen that same look of cornered desperation in the eyes of every liar she had ever confronted. "Elena Morales," Esperanza said, her voice now carrying the weight of a mother's grief and a grandmother's rage. 23 years old, nursing student. She was here visiting me 3 years ago when you broke in. The police said she surprised burglars, that she fought back, that she died from a head injury when she fell during the struggle. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them as the truth hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Miguel's hands shook as he stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes. Roberto looked between them, finally understanding that this had moved far beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. "She was so beautiful," Esperanza continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Going to be a nurse, wanted to help people. She was going to get married next month to a boy from church. They were going to have babies, give me great-grandchildren to spoil." Tears began to flow down her weathered cheeks, but her gun hand remained steady. "Instead, I had to bury her, had to watch her mother, my daughter, collapse at the funeral. Had to see her fiancé turn to drinking because he couldn't handle the loss." Miguel finally looked up, and for the first time Esperanza saw something that might have been genuine remorse in his eyes. "It was an accident," he whispered. "She came out of nowhere, started screaming, grabbed a lamp. Roberto pushed her and she fell, hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. We never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But you didn't call for help," Esperanza said, her voice deadly quiet. "You didn't try to save her. You just took what you came for and left my granddaughter to die alone on my living room floor." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath, as 3 people sat in a kitchen where the past and present had collided with devastating force. Roberto had gone completely still, the duct tape forgotten in his hands as he realized they weren't just facing an angry homeowner. They were facing the grandmother of their victim, armed with both a gun and the absolute moral authority that comes from seeking justice for murdered family. "The tattoo," Esperanza said, gesturing toward Miguel's arm. "You got it to remember her. Not out of guilt, but as a trophy. Like she was some kind of conquest." Miguel's silence was answer enough. The rose tattoo, which he had probably shown off to friends as proof of his criminal prowess, now marked him as surely as Cain's mark had marked the first murderer. The revelation hung in the air like a death sentence. Esperanza's finger tightened on the trigger, as 3 years of sleepless nights, unanswered prayers, and consuming grief crystallized into a single moment of terrible clarity. She had prayed for justice, begged God to reveal her granddaughter's killers, and now here they sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Elena had eaten her last meal. "You know what the worst part was?" Esperanza asked, her voice eerily calm. "The police told me she fought. That meant she was conscious when you left her there. She was alone, bleeding, probably calling for help that never came. My Elena died thinking no one cared enough to save her." Roberto finally found his voice, desperation making him bold. "Look, we're sorry about your granddaughter, okay? But killing us won't bring her back. You're a religious woman, right? What would your priest say about murder?" Esperanza's laugh was hollow as an empty grave. "Father Martinez? He's the one who held me when I collapsed at Elena's funeral. He's the one who told me that sometimes God works through human hands to deliver justice when the law fails." She paused, studying their terrified faces. "Besides, who said anything about murder?" She moved to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a cell phone. Not the old rotary phone on the wall, but a modern smartphone that Carlos had insisted she carry. With practiced ease, she began recording a video, keeping the camera trained on the two bound men. "My name is Esperanza Morales," she said clearly into the phone. "It's 2:47 a.m. on July 8, 2025. 3 years ago, my granddaughter Elena was murdered during a robbery in this house. Tonight, her killers broke in again, and I've captured them." She turned the camera to show Miguel's tattoo clearly. "This one has my granddaughter's initials tattooed on his arm like some kind of sick trophy." Miguel tried to protest, but Esperanza continued recording. "They've confessed to killing Elena and to robbing at least 6 other elderly residents in this neighborhood. They came here tonight to rob me, but instead they found justice waiting." She stopped recording and set the phone aside. "That video is automatically backed up to the cloud and will be sent to my son Carlos, the police, and the local news station if I don't check in every 12 hours. So even if something happens to me, the truth about Elena's murder will finally come out." The two men exchanged panicked glances as they realized the trap they had walked into. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully orchestrated reckoning that had been 3 years in the making. "Now," Esperanza said, picking up the gun again, "we're going to take a little trip. There's an old mine shaft about 20 miles into the desert, where my husband used to take the boys hunting. Very isolated, very deep, the kind of place where people disappear and are never found." The desert night was cold and unforgiving as Esperanza forced the two men into her late husband's pickup truck. The ancient Ford had seen better days, but it still ran strong, much like its owner. She had made them finish taping each other's hands, then marched them outside at gunpoint, their protests falling on deaf ears that had heard enough lies for one lifetime. "Please, Señora," Roberto begged as she started the engine. "We'll confess to the police. We'll tell them everything about your granddaughter. Just don't do this." Esperanza adjusted the rearview mirror to keep an eye on them in the truck bed. "You had 3 years to confess. 3 years to come forward and give my family closure. Instead, you got tattoos and kept robbing innocent people." The truck rumbled to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin swords of judgment. As they drove deeper into the desert, following dirt roads that Miguel had traveled countless times during hunting trips with his sons, Esperanza felt a strange peace settling over her. The weight of grief that had pressed down on her shoulders for 3 years was finally lifting, replaced by the satisfaction of a job well done. The mine shaft appeared in the headlights exactly where she remembered it, a gaping wound in the earth that had been abandoned for decades. She parked the truck and forced the men out, their legs shaking so badly they could barely stand. The desert stretched endlessly around them, silent except for the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant howl of coyotes. "This is where it ends," she announced, raising the gun one final time. But instead of pointing it at them, she fired 3 shots into the air, a signal that echoed across the empty landscape like thunder. Within minutes, headlights appeared on the horizon, Carlos's truck followed by 2 police cars and an ambulance. As the vehicles surrounded them, Esperanza finally lowered the gun and smiled. "You see, boys," she said as the officers approached, "I never intended to kill you. I just wanted you to experience the same terror you put Elena through, the same helplessness, the same certainty that your life was about to end." As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, Miguel looked at her with something approaching respect. "You planned this whole thing?" Esperanza nodded. "From the moment I found that gun 3 months ago, I've been waiting, watching, preparing. Elena deserved justice, and sometimes an old woman has to take matters into her own hands." The 2 men were led away to face charges for Elena's murder and the string of robberies. Esperanza watched them go, finally at peace, knowing that her granddaughter could rest easy, knowing her killers would never hurt anyone again. The end. The story of Esperanza Morales became legend in San Miguel, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that underestimating the power of a grandmother's love is the last mistake some criminals ever make.